Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? The sun had only just begun its climb over the Mojave, spilling molten gold across the sands of 29 Palms. The range stretched endlessly, a kingdom of dust, mirage, and echo. The air shimmered in restless heat, the kind that warped the horizon and made even solid things seem uncertain. It was the kind of day the Marines called a burner, where patience melted faster than brass on the asphalt. They lined the firing lanes like soldiers at attention, sleeves rolled, boots sinking in grit, rifles gleaming beneath the white blaze of morning. The air was alive with the rhythm of gunfire, that steady percussion of control, noise, and youth. Every trigger pull echoed confidence. Every clang of steel was a heartbeat of pride. And at the far end of the range, someone didn't belong. A woman, early 30s, maybe mid, sleeves rolled neatly, calm eyes the color of worn oak, not a trace of arrogance, not even a hint of hurry. She moved differently from the others, deliberate and quiet, adjusting a borrowed rifle on a sandbag with the same care someone else might use to fold a flag. Her name, though no one here seemed to know it, was Elena Cross. To the young Marines watching, she was just the contractor. Some civilian consultant from Quantico or one of those defense labs that sent analysts in pressed shirts and clean boots to talk about math no one cared about. She wore no uniform, no rank tabs, no insignia, just khaki cargo pants, a pale tactical shirt, and a pair of eyes that looked like they'd seen something she'd rather forget. They whispered as she worked. "Ma'am, that's not how you zero a scope," one of them called, half joking, half testing. Another smirked, "Careful, ma'am, that one's live steel, not a demo." The laughter rolled light, good-natured, but with that subtle sting that said, "We don't take you seriously." The sergeant running the range didn't stop them. He laughed under his breath, assuming she was just another clipboard in computer type. Someone to audit their performance, not improve it. Elena didn't look up, didn't argue. She only adjusted the scope again, slow, precise, as if every click had meaning. No one here knew her past. Not the long months in Helmand Province. Not the name once printed on a sniper roster under Task Force Anvil. Not the record she never talked about or the partner she never mentioned. To them, she was invisible. And for the most part, she preferred it that way. She'd been working as a contractor for 2 years, calibrating new ballistic software, running simulations, translating the language of wind and distance into lines of code. "Teach others what you know," the Corps had told her when she turned down re-enlistment. She said yes, not out of pride, but because someone had to make the numbers right. Someone had to make sure the next soldier who took a shot didn't pay for it with his life. The irony never escaped her. She was once one of the best long-range marksmen in the field. Now she was teaching machines how to do what her instincts once knew by heart. Still, there was something sacred in the math, something human. She adjusted the tripod, checked the crosswind, and steadied the old M200 intervention. The rifle was heavy, familiar, like a handshake from a past she wasn't ready to remember. The Marines kept talking. "Bet she's one of those analysts," a corporal said. "Probably never fired a live round." Another chimed in. "Hey, Gunny, maybe she's here to teach us PowerPoint." Even Gunnery Sergeant Mason cracked a grin. "Careful, boys," he said. "The desert humbles everyone eventually." Elena glanced at him, a faint smile flickering across her face. "You're not wrong, Gunny," she said quietly. "The desert always teaches respect, usually the hard way." The corporal laughed. "Guess we'll see if it respects you back, ma'am." But something in her tone unsettled a few of them. There was no bite in it, no sarcasm, just calm, the kind of calm that only comes from someone who's heard worse and survived it. She looked through the scope, the reticle floating steady over the steel targets downrange. Through the shimmer, the world looked soft and far away. For a moment, she saw something else. Not 29 Palms. Not California. Helmand. Sandstorm rising. A voice in her ear. Range 2210, wind 5 left, you got this, cross. Then the flash, the blast that had torn through her world and left her clutching a cracked scope, and a silence that wouldn't end. She blinked, the California sun came back, she exhaled through her nose. Focus. Wind 8 knots cross. Temperature 98. Mirage drift unstable. Just numbers, just calibration. Ma'am, you sure you know what you're doing? The corporal again, trying for humor but missing the mark. She smiled faintly. Older rifles have steadier souls, she said. That drew another round of chuckles. She fired her first shot. The sound cracked across the valley like a slap of thunder. The round struck 3 inches wide, perfectly off exactly as intended. A few Marines whistled. "Don't worry, ma'am," one called. "We'll teach you how to shoot." Laughter again, louder this time, fueled by the heat and the habit of underestimating quiet people. Elena ejected the casing, logged her numbers, adjusted the windage by a quarter mil and fired again. Another miss. 2 for 2. "Maybe she's painting the sand," a voice called. "Guess she's scared of hitting something." She didn't flinch, didn't turn, just murmured, "Sometimes you wait for the wind to decide if it wants to help." The older Sergeant Lewis looked up sharply. He'd heard that phrase before, sniper talk. But the others missed it. "Oh, the wind's fault, huh?" the corporal said. "Didn't realize the breeze takes requests." The laughter faltered. A few Marines stopped smiling. Something about the way she stayed still, breathing slow, deliberate, in rhythm with the flags downrange, didn't match the picture of the civilian analyst they'd made in their heads. Elena fired again. The casing bounced off the bench. Another miss, consistent, controlled. Mason's voice came over the comms. "Lane 7, you planning to hit anything today?" Elena keyed her mic calmly. "Negative, Gunny. Tracking lens drift under heat expansion." "Copy that, scientist," he chuckled. More laughter, but thinner now. "Wasting ammo," someone muttered. "Not wasted," she said softly, "just measured." It silenced them again, not because the words were sharp, but because they were. There was no need to prove anything. The calm itself was unsettling. A private leaned toward the corporal. "She's not random. Look at her breathing. Look at her trigger hold." The corporal shook his head. "Yeah, then why's she missing?" Elena didn't answer. She fired again, the shot landing in the same tight drift pattern. Mason walked behind her, watching. "You got enough data yet, ma'am?" She looked up, smiled faintly. "Almost." "Well," he grinned, "maybe we'll see a hit before sundown." "Maybe," she said, and went back to work. Minutes stretched. The laughter softened into silence. The desert wind hummed like an old song. They didn't realize they were being tested, not for aim, but for respect. Every pull of her trigger was a line of calculation, a pulse of memory. The corporal leaned closer, watching the faint tattoo under her sleeve as she adjusted the rifle. A coiled serpent wrapped around a crosshair. He frowned. "What's that?" Lewis's jaw tightened. "That's not a random tattoo." He'd seen it before, a decade ago, somewhere far from this safe range. Task Force Anvil, Joint Army-Marine Sniper Detachment, disbanded after Helmand. The legend said their shots could reach beyond the horizon, that they were ghosts, silent, unseen, precise. He looked again at her stillness, at the way she spoke to the wind. It couldn't be. But it was. The desert seemed to know it before anyone else did. The flags downrange trembled. The mirage shimmered. Elena lifted her head, eyes tracing the long, flat line of heat. She could feel it, the same pattern of wind, the same rhythm of silence before a decision. "Ma'am," the corporal called, his tone somewhere between mockery and curiosity. "You gonna hit anything today, or just keep talking to the air?" She smiled faintly. Sometimes the air answers back. They didn't understand what she meant. "Not yet." She recentered the rifle, fingers steady, her mind quiet. She could almost hear Hale's voice again, soft in her ear. "Stay with the wind, Cross. Let it talk first." The desert had stopped laughing. The next sound, the next decision, would change everything. What made the desert suddenly go silent? It wasn't the heat, though it pressed down like a weight. It wasn't the laughter, though that too had burned itself out. It was something else, something unseen, the moment before understanding arrives. Alina Cross lay prone behind the rifle, cheeks settled against the worn stock, her breathing slow and measured. The range around her shimmered under a restless mirage. To the young Marines, she looked like she was simply adjusting for wind. But to anyone who'd ever fired for keeps, that stillness meant something else. It meant memory. Her fingers traced the turret dial, counting in whispers. 1.2, 1.3, a rhythm, almost a prayer. The whisper of someone who had spent years talking to wind instead of people. Sergeant Lewis was the first to feel the chill. He'd seen that same ritual in Helmand, snipers murmuring numbers like penance. He'd watched one of them fire through sandstorms that turned the world into blindness and still hit a man the size of a door handle at half a mile. He stared now, his pulse slow and heavy. Couldn't be, could it? A gust swept the range. Dust curled across the firing lanes. The corporal coughed into the silence, trying to fill it. You good down there, ma'am?" No answer, just the quiet click of the bolt sliding home, a sound so clean it cut the heat. Gunnery Sergeant Mason approached from the shade of the tower, coffee forgotten in his hand. He'd been around too long not to recognize discipline when he saw it. This wasn't lab coat composure. This was battlefield stillness, the kind learned when one wrong breath costs a life. He stopped 3 feet behind her. "Ma'am, what exactly are you testing?" Her voice came calm, almost detached. "Seeing if the wind still remembers me." Mason blinked, unsure if he'd misheard. The words hung there, strange and heavy. No one laughed this time. For the next 30 seconds, nothing moved. No jokes, no side chatter. Even the radio static felt respectful, waiting for permission. Then she spoke again, soft, precise. "Range control. Request lane 7 clearance to engage extended plate." The tower responded after a pause. "Confirmed. Target distance 3800 meters." A murmur rippled down the line. 3,800. Nearly 2.5 miles. No one hit that. No one even tried, not seriously. The range record was a rumor, a story told over beers by men who'd failed to get close. Mason's brows lifted. "You sure about that, Cross?" "Affirmative," she said. "I just need quiet on the line." And somehow the desert obeyed. Every Marine went still. Boots shifted once, then stopped. The air itself seemed to lean toward her. She set the rifle into the sandbag cradle, adjusting the stock until it fit like an old friend. The M200 intervention wasn't new, its finish scarred, its barrel heat-stained. But it had that solid honesty of something built to outlast men. Her cheek pressed against the comb. Her right hand found the trigger guard. She breathed once, twice. The rhythm was ritual. A private named Nolan crouched beside her, binoculars trembling in his hands. He'd volunteered before he realized what that meant. "Wind, 7.5 left," he said, voice thin. She nodded, almost maternal. "Good call, Nolan, hold it." He swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." She gave him a small squeeze on the arm, reassurance, not drama, the kind of touch that says you'll remember this. Her mind went back unbidden to another day, another wind. Helmand Province, 2011. Sand whipping against goggles, Hale's voice steady in her ear. 300 meters out, crosswind 9 left, you're good. She'd smiled through the storm. "You call it, I'll trust it." Then the explosion, a white bloom swallowing sound. The world had spun, and when it stopped, Hale was gone. Only his voice remained, lodged somewhere between memory and guilt. She blinked, returning to now. The desert of California hummed around her. "Shot one," she whispered, "on my call." The trigger broke with the gentleness of a heartbeat. The rifle barked once, sharp and final. The report rolled outward, chased by the supersonic crack. The round disappeared into heat haze. Seconds stretched, long, endless seconds where every man on the range held his breath. Then, far out near the horizon, a small column of dust rose shy of the plate. "Impact low, 3 meters," Nolan said, barely breathing. "Copy," she murmured, adjusting .5 mil up, .3 right. No disappointment, no reaction, just math. She cycled the bolt, chambered another round. The corporal, the same one who'd mocked her all morning, tried to smile, but it wouldn't come. His throat was dry. This didn't look like luck. It looked like control. "Second shot," she said softly. The second report cracked across the valley. The plume this time kissed the steel rim and curled inward like a whisper. "Close," Nolan said, eyes wide. Alina's gaze never left the scope. "It's learning, let it breathe." The words were strange, almost poetic, but the Marines around her felt the truth in them. Something was happening that textbooks couldn't explain. Mason set his cup down, unable to look away. Every instinct in him, every decade of service, told him this wasn't a show. This was a lesson. Alina's lips moved silently, counting, feeling, waiting. The wind flags downrange fluttered once, then held, all in alignment. She felt it through her cheek, through the pressure in the trigger, through the language of air. Now, the third pull wasn't about proving anything. It was about remembering why she ever picked up a rifle in the first place. She squeezed. The world paused. 9 seconds of travel, 9 seconds where time didn't exist. In that silence she could almost hear hail again, steady, cross, the wind, with you. Then, ping, a sound so clean, so pure. It cut through 2 miles of heat and landed in the center of every chest on the range. Nolan gasped, "Center impact, it's clean." The shout from the far spotter confirmed it. Lane 7, center plate hit. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The desert held its breath. Then, one by one, realization dawned. She'd done it. A perfect strike at 3,800 meters, a shot that wasn't supposed to be possible. No applause, no cheering, just awe. Alina exhaled slowly, eyes still in the scope. Mirage settled, wind averaged, the math worked. The corporal's jaw worked soundlessly. Mason stepped closer, voice low. "You sure that was you?" She smiled faintly, almost shy. "It was the wind, I just listened." He didn't know what to say. Lewis, the older sergeant, crouched near her, eyes fixed on the faint tattoo under her sleeve. "Task Force Anvil," he whispered. The corporal turned, frowning. "What?" Lewis swallowed. "That mark, the coiled serpent, it's an old sniper unit, Joint Task Force, Army and Marine. They called themselves Anvil, operated deep in Helmand before disbanding. Ghost team." The air changed again, thicker somehow. Every Marine who'd mocked her earlier stood frozen, piecing it together. Nolan glanced at the metal tag on her range bag, half covered in dust. The letters etched into it, Cross and Hail. 2004, 1 confirmed. He blinked. "Wait, Cross and Hail, that cross." Mason turned slowly toward her. The name struck something buried, a story whispered over deployments, a legend nobody believed. The duo who'd held off an ambush from 2 kilometers out. The shot that saved an entire company trapped in a valley. The one the Corps never officially recorded. He stared at her, voice gone quiet. "Staff Sergeant Alina Cross from Helmand." She didn't answer, didn't have to. The silence did it for her. The corporal, pale now, stepped back a half pace. The same mouth that had mocked her couldn't form a single word. Alina rose to a knee, chambered the spent casing, and placed it on the bench beside her notebook. Her hands moved steady, reverent. "He'd have liked that," she murmured. Hale, Lewis asked softly. She nodded once. The desert wind swept across the line, tugging at their sleeves. It carried dust and something else, humility. Mason took off his cap, rubbed the back of his neck, and looked out toward the distant plate still gleaming under the sun. "Ma'am," he said, voice rough, "permission to shake your hand." She hesitated. "Only if you promise to teach your men wine drift the right way." He smiled, small and sincere. "Yes, ma'am." The laughter that returned wasn't cruel anymore. It was warm, human, the sound of men who'd learned something without a lecture. Behind them, the flag at the base of the range snapped in the wind, red and white, noise and silence, pride and regret. Nolan lowered his binoculars. His voice came small. "Ma'am, how'd you know it was going to hit?" Elena smiled faintly. "You don't ever know. You just listen until the silence tells you it's time." He nodded slowly, as if the words meant more than he understood. Mason looked out at the horizon. "You know," he said, "they'll tell this story for years." "Then tell it right," she answered. The Marines gathered their gear in silence. No one dared reset the plate. It stayed out there, shining like a mirror, a perfect circle carved by patience and grief. Elena packed the rifle carefully, like a relic. When she closed the case, the sound felt final, not triumphant, but peaceful. As the sun began to drop, long shadows stretched across the firing lanes. The wind eased, dust settled. The day, once full of noise and arrogance, ended in reverence. And somewhere deep inside her, for the first time in years, the ache eased just enough for her to breathe. She had promised herself she'd never fire again, unless she had to. Today, she finally understood why she'd kept that promise for so long. Because every shot carried a ghost, and some ghosts were worth carrying. The desert didn't laugh anymore. It remembered. Why did the photograph stop them all in their tracks? Gunnery Sergeant Mason was the first to notice it, that small rectangle of faded color hanging on the office wall at the edge of the range. It caught the late afternoon sun just right, the glass glowing like a candle. He didn't mean to look. He'd only stepped inside to radio in the range report, but something about the frame pulled at him, like a whisper from the past. Two figures stood shoulder to shoulder in the picture, desert fatigues, helmets off, dust smeared across grins that weren't cocky so much as earned. The placard beneath the image was scratched but legible. Task Force Anvil, Cross and Hale, Helmand Province 2011. Mason froze. His breath stuck halfway between disbelief and memory. He remembered the briefing after that mission, the one no one talked about anymore. The report classified, the names redacted. Only whispers survived. Two-person team, impossible range, company saved. He turned slowly, looking out the open window toward the firing line, where the woman from that photo was now packing away her rifle. For a long moment, he just watched her. She was moving with quiet care, the kind of care you use when something matters more than it should. Every motion deliberate, as if the weapon might shatter the instant respect slipped. Behind her, the younger Marines lingered in small, uncertain clusters. The jokes had died hours ago, but no one seemed ready to leave. They were waiting for permission, for explanation, maybe for absolution. Even the corporal who'd led the teasing stayed rooted where he was, helmet under one arm, eyes fixed on the distant plate. That perfect hit gleamed under the orange sun like a small truth no one could unsee. Mason stepped back outside, the wind catching his sleeves. He cleared his throat. "All right, listen up," he called, but the usual bark in his voice was gone. What came out sounded almost reverent. The Marines turned toward him, boots crunching on gravel. He looked at Elena. "Ma'am, that picture inside the office, that was you and Sergeant Hale." She paused mid-movement. Her hand lingered on the case latch. Then she nodded once. "It was," she said softly. A ripple moved through the group, not noise, not words, just a collective intake of breath. Lewis, the older sergeant, lowered his eyes. The corporal swallowed hard. Mason took a step closer, his tone careful. I remember that name. Everyone in the Corps does. Kandahar, right? The convoy rescue. Alina's gaze dropped to the sand. Hale called the wind, she murmured. I just pulled the trigger. No boast, no weight, just a fact laid down like a stone. Nolan, still clutching his binoculars, looked from her to Mason. Wait, that was the shot that saved Charlie Company. My uncle was in that unit. His voice cracked halfway through. He said someone up in the hills covered them for 8 minutes straight. Alina's eyes softened. 8:32, she corrected quietly. Hale timed everyone. She closed the rifle case. The latch clicked with the finality of a door closing on an old house. For a moment, no one spoke. Only the flags whispered against their poles. Finally, Mason said it, almost under his breath. Ma'am, I didn't know. She gave a small shake of her head. You weren't supposed to. Her voice was calm, but underneath it lay years of dust and silence. The corporal shifted awkwardly, eyes down. Ma'am, I shouldn't have. She cut him off gently. You learned, that's enough. He nodded once, shame and gratitude tangled together. Mason straightened, the old instincts of ceremony rising despite himself. He brought his hand to his brow, a slow, deliberate salute. Around him, boots shifted. Then one by one, every Marine followed. No orders, no trumpet, just a line of soldiers standing in the amber light, rifles grounded, silence thick enough to taste. Alina didn't return the salute. Her hands stayed at her sides, fingers twitching once before settling. You don't salute ghosts, she said quietly. You just remember them. Mason's voice came rough. Ma'am, permission to shake your hand. She looked at him for a long second, then nodded. Only if you promise to teach them the wind right. He smiled, the kind of smile that comes from understanding too late. Yes, ma'am, I promise. The two shook hands, not hero and admirer, not officer and enlisted, just two soldiers who knew what silence costs. Behind them, Lewis stepped forward, clearing his throat. Gunny, he said, we leaving the plate out there. Mason turned toward the horizon. The steel target shimmered under heat haze, the whole dead center gleaming gold. Nobody touches it, he ordered. That plate stays. The tower operator's voice crackled through the radio. Copy that, Gunny, plate stays. A few Marines exhaled quietly, as if relieved to have something sacred left unspoken. The sun kept falling, painting the range in layers of copper and shadow. One by one, the Marines packed their gear, but not with their usual chatter. This time they moved slower, thoughtful. Every glance toward Alina carried the same unspoken question. How many ghosts do we owe our comfort to? Nolan lingered after the others drifted toward the trucks. He looked at her, hesitation fighting curiosity. Ma'am, he said finally, when you took that shot, how'd you know the wind would settle? She gave him the smallest of smiles. You never know. You just listen until the silence tells you it's time. He frowned slightly, trying to understand, then nodded because some lessons can't be written down. Mason watched her as the last of the daylight bled from the sky. You know, he said quietly, they'll tell this story for years. Alina slung the rifle strap over her shoulder. Then tell it right, she answered. He nodded once. Aye, ma'am. She started walking toward the parking lot, boots leaving small prints in the dust. The Marines didn't follow. They just stood and watched until the desert swallowed her shape in the glare. When she reached her old pickup, she paused, hands resting on the doorframe. The horizon glowed red behind her, the same color as flare light in Helmand. For a heartbeat, she saw it again, Hale laughing through the headset, promising coffee when they got back. The next moment, smoke, static, the blast. She blinked hard, the memory faded. The desert was quiet again. Later, inside the small range office, Nolan wandered back in to drop the day's logs. His eyes drifted again to that photograph on the wall, Cross and Hale, standing shoulder to shoulder, dust and pride in equal measure. The edges were yellowed, but their smiles hadn't aged. He called softly, "Gunny, you've seen this." Mason stepped beside him, following his gaze. For a long moment the older man just stared, then he let out a slow breath. "Yeah," he murmured, "now I have." Lewis joined them, his voice hushed. "You ever think we'd meet one of 'em?" Mason shook his head. "No, and I hope to God we remember what it felt like." They stood there in silence. Outside, the flag cracked once against the pole, the sound sharp and clean. That night, Alina parked her truck on a ridge overlooking the base lights. The desert spread out below her, endless, familiar, merciless. She sat on the hood, hands folded around a tin cup of lukewarm coffee. The stars blinked awake one by one. In her lap lay a small brass casing, the last round she'd fired. She turned it slowly between her fingers, watching the metal catch starlight. "Every shot's a promise," Hale used to say. "Every promise costs something." She whispered it now into the wind, half-smile tugging at her mouth. "You always did talk too much, Marcus." For a moment she let herself remember him, his dry humor, the way he read mirage like a man reading poetry, the constant smell of instant coffee and gun oil. She remembered the sound of his laughter echoing through the valley after a clean hit, even under fire. Then the quiet afterward, the long years of not hearing that laugh again. Her eyes stung, she let them. The wind brushed across her cheek, gentle this time, almost kind. It whispered through the sagebrush, a low, steady rhythm. She closed her eyes and listened. Somewhere in it, she thought she heard his voice, not words, just presence. When she opened her eyes, dawn was already hinting pale behind the hills. She slid the casing into her pocket, climbed off the hood, and whispered, "Still got your wind calls right, partner." The silence answered the way silence always does, with understanding. At 600, the range sergeant found the note she'd left on the bench. Just a folded page torn from her notebook. 3 words written in careful pencil. "Hold, breathe, listen." Mason read it twice, then set it back down. "That'll do," he said quietly. The corporal who had mocked her stood beside him, hat in hand. "Gunny, what do we tell the next rotation?" Mason looked at the far plate, still gleaming under the rising sun. "Tell 'em about the wind," he said, "and the woman who listened better than any of us. The desert at 29 Palms doesn't keep footprints for long. The wind eats them, reshapes the surface until the past looks smooth again. But for those who were there that day, something stayed carved a little deeper, a memory that refused to blow away. Because sometimes the lessons that last aren't shouted. They're whispered across distance, carried by wind, remembered in the steady hands of those who finally learned what silence really means." Why did she hesitate before opening the envelope? 3 days had passed since the shot. The range at 29 Palms had returned to its usual rhythm, gunfire, laughter, dust. But something invisible lingered in the air, like the echo of a promise that refused to fade. Every Marine who had been there carried a different posture now. They spoke softer, stood straighter, and when the wind shifted, a few of them instinctively looked toward the far plate, that perfect circle still shining at the edge of the desert. Nobody had dared to repaint it. Nobody even talked about it loudly. The shot had become a kind of legend already, a story told in lowered voices, with half smiles and slow headshakes. "You should have seen it," they'd say. "Didn't look like a person shooting. Looked like the wind itself decided to remember someone." They didn't mention the laughter from before. They didn't have to. And Alina. She hadn't been back to the range since. The mail clerk spotted her that morning. The quiet woman with the old truck and the calm eyes. The kind of person who made everyone else lower their voice without knowing why. "Ma'am, got something for you," the clerk said, sliding an envelope across the counter like it might bite. The seal shimmered gold. United States Marine Corps Commandant's Office. Even the air seemed to pause. Nobody out here got letters from that high up the chain, not unless they were being decorated, promoted, or remembered. Elena signed the log, tucked the envelope under her arm, and walked out without opening it. The clerk watched her go, curiosity dying on his tongue. Some things weren't meant to be asked out loud. Outside, the desert light burned sharp and clean. She climbed into her truck, a weathered old Chevy that had seen both war zones and Walmart parking lots, and let the engine idle. The letter sat on the passenger seat, the edges fluttering faintly in the breeze. She didn't need to read it to know what it said. Recognition, record, formal gratitude. The words would be polite, exact, and empty of what mattered most. The Corps had always been good at words. Hale had been better at silence. She smiled faintly at the thought. Then she shifted into gear and drove north, away from the base, away from the noise, the ranks, the curious stares. The asphalt turned to gravel, then to dirt. The horizon opened wide, endless and gold. The kind of quiet you could hear your thoughts in. She hadn't planned where she was going. But her hands knew. They always did. After 30 miles, the road narrowed to a dry ridge. The truck bumped over old ruts until it stopped before a low rise overlooking the valley. The desert here was stripped of sound, only wind and distance. At the top of the ridge stood a simple wooden stake, half buried in sand. A small brass nameplate, worn by sun and time. Hale M. Elena sat for a long moment, watching the heat shimmer over the horizon. Then she climbed out, boots crunching softly. The wind pressed against her back, steady, warm, familiar. When she reached the stake, she knelt. Her hand brushed the nameplate. The metal was hot, but it didn't burn. She pulled the envelope from her pocket and tore it open carefully. Inside was a single page, thick, official, heavy with language. Staff Sergeant Elena Cross. The Marine Corps acknowledges your contribution to the Joint Sniper Training Program and the verified 3,800-meter impact at Range 29 Palms, California. Your actions reflect skill, discipline, and service beyond measure. At the bottom, the signature read, "For valor and instruction beyond measure, Semper Fidelis." She read it twice, then folded it neatly back into the envelope and set it aside on the sand. It wasn't the letter that made her throat tighten. It was what wasn't written. No mention of him, no mention of the other half of every shot she'd ever taken. The world had moved on, filed, archived, forgotten, but she hadn't. She reached into her pocket and took out the last brass casing from the range, the one that had made history. The sunlight glinted off its dented primer. She turned it slowly between her fingers, the motion hypnotic. "Every shot's a promise," she whispered. "Every promise costs something." She set the casing beside 3 older ones already half buried at the base of the stake. The wind stirred faintly, scattering a thin layer of dust across them, but the shine still caught the light. Then she sat back and let herself remember. Helmand Province, June 2011. The air thick with dust and gunfire. Hale's voice steady in her ear, cutting through static. Cross range 2210, wind 9 left, mirage unstable, you good. Always, she'd said, fingers steady on the trigger. They were 2 dots on a hillside, half buried in rock and prayer. Below them, a convoy trapped in the open, friendly vehicles pinned by machine gun fire from a ridge. Every second counted. Targets, she asked. 4, maybe 5. One's got an RPG. Distance 2,400 give or take. She calculated faster than fear could reach her. Hold half mil left. I'll take the one on the scope. He chuckled low and warm. Copy, Professor. That was what he called her, Professor. Because she saw numbers in everything. Because she could read wind the way poets read rain. The first shot cracked across the valley, then another, and another. Hale called the wind. She followed it. Together they built silence out of chaos. When it ended, the ridge was empty of hostiles. The convoy was moving again. And then the explosion. A landmine buried under their own position. The blast turned the world white and soundless. When the dust cleared, she was still alive. He was. The medics had found her half-conscious, clutching the cracked scope against her chest like a lifeline. They said it was a miracle she'd survived. She'd called it punishment. She never picked up a rifle again after that, not until 29 Palms. The wind shifted, snapping her back to the present. She looked up. The desert stretched endlessly, the same kind of sky they'd shared, different continent, same silence. She took a slow breath. "You'd have liked that shot," she said softly. The wind behaved for once. The breeze tugged at her braid as if answering. She smiled. "You were right, Marcus. The wind always knows who's listening." She stayed there a while, not praying, not crying, just listening. The wind brushed against her sleeve, whispering over the tattoo that circled her arm. The coiled serpent around the crosshair seemed to move faintly in the light, alive again for a moment. She closed her eyes and imagined the old days, two figures on a hill, laughing between shots, their silence a language all its own. Some memories didn't fade. They just learned how to wait. When she finally rose, the horizon had softened into gold. The world felt quieter, kinder. She brushed the sand from her knees, placed a hand on the nameplate one last time, and whispered, "Still got your wind calls right, partner." Then she turned and began walking back toward the truck. The 4 casings glinted in the fatting sun, 4 promises, 4 ghosts. The wind lifted a thin veil of dust, covering them gently, not erasing them, just keeping them safe. The drive back was long and silent. The sky turned violet, then deep blue. Stars emerged like old friends. She rolled the windows down and let the desert air flood in, dry, warm, alive. She thought about the Marines who had laughed, about the ones who hadn't, about how quickly the world judged quietness as weakness. But she didn't resent them. Once she'd been that young too, certain that noise proved strength. Now she knew better. Courage wasn't about loudness. It was about steadiness. About breathing when everyone else holds theirs. About acting when words mean nothing. She pulled over once more, halfway down the ridge, just to look back. The moonlight painted the stake in silver. The casings caught the glow faintly, 4 small stars in the sand. Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Respect isn't loud, Marcus. It just endures." Then she climbed into the truck and drove on, headlights carving a pale road through darkness. Behind her, the wind picked up again, carrying her words farther than sound could travel. At dawn, Mason stood alone on the range. He hadn't been able to sleep. The desert called him back, not out of duty, but out of something he couldn't quite name. The air was cool now, the kind of quiet that feels like the world holding its breath before sunrise. He walked down to lane 7. The sand was smooth again, no footprints left. But the target at the far end still glowed faintly in the early light, a perfect center hole, untouched, sacred. He raised a hand against the sun and whispered, "We'll tell it right, ma'am." Then he smiled because he knew the wind was listening. Why did she still hear his voice in the wind? The desert had fallen behind her miles ago, but its silence stayed inside her ears, behind her ribs, in every small space the noise of the world couldn't reach. The road north wound through the low California hills, dry brush leaning in the same direction as the wind. Her truck hummed steadily, the only heartbeat that mattered for now. In the passenger seat, the folded letter lay where she'd left it, unread again. Recognition, record, history, words on paper. But the story that mattered wasn't written anywhere. It lived in the spaces between shots, in the breath between numbers, in the small quiet of people who did their jobs and vanished before applause could find them. She didn't need medals, she just needed peace. But peace never came easy to people who learned to live inside crosshairs. She slowed as the road curved past an overlook, the valley stretching wide beneath her. For a long minute, she let the engine idle. The horizon reminded her of Afghanistan, that same cruel beauty, the same shimmer of heat that made everything look like a mirage. It brought her back, uninvited, to the beginning. Helmand, 2010. The world was dust and distance. She'd been 23 then, steady hands, sharp eyes, trying too hard to prove she belonged in a unit that had never seen a woman behind a sniper rifle. They hadn't said it out loud, but she'd felt it every time she walked into the tent. The quiet pause before greetings, the sideways looks, the cautious respect that was quite trust. Until him. Sergeant Marcus Hale. He looked up from cleaning his rifle the first day she arrived, took one look at her and said, "You ever miss?" "Not twice," she'd replied. He'd laughed one short, genuine burst of amusement, then scooted over on the bench and handed her a scope. "Then sit. Let's see what math looks like when it breathes." That was how it began. He was older by 6 years, slower in speech, quicker in instinct. Where she measured, he guessed. Where she calculated, he felt. But between them, something rare formed balance. She called the numbers, he called the wind. They learned each other's rhythm like music. By their third deployment, they didn't need words. A tilt of the chin meant ready. A tap of the index finger meant hold. A breath in meant wait. Together, they'd built a language that only existed between two rifles and one impossible distance. The others in the unit called them ghosts. It wasn't wrong. They lived in the spaces no one else dared step into, mountains that ate radio signals, ridges so far from extraction that the sky itself felt foreign. Their reward was silence. Their punishment was memory. One night, after a long overwatch that turned into nothing but empty terrain and silence, they'd sat on a ridge watching the stars creep west. "You ever think we're invisible for a reason?" Hale asked, his voice soft through the headset. "You mean expendable?" He chuckled. "No, I mean, maybe the world only lets ghosts do this kind of work." She'd smiled faintly. "You don't sound like a ghost." He tilted his head, looking out into the dark. "That's because I still believe in the living." She didn't answer then. But later, when he dozed off against a rock, she'd written the line down in her notebook, "Believe in the living." It was still there, folded and faded, buried somewhere in her duffel to this day. Her phone buzzed on the seat beside her, pulling her back to the present. A text from Mason. "Ma'am, just wanted you to know, we left the plate up. Nobody touches it, Semper Fi." She stared at the message for a long moment, thumb hovering above the screen. Then she typed back 2 words. "Tell them thanks," and set the phone face down. The road ahead shimmered with heat. Sometimes gratitude hurt more than mockery ever did. That night she stopped at a small roadside diner halfway to nowhere. The kind with one flickering neon sign and coffee that tasted like yesterday's fire. The waitress recognized her from the base, or thought she did. "You one of them instructors?" the woman asked, refilling her cup. Elena smiled, "Something like that." "You teach shooting?" "Patience." The waitress laughed softly, not realizing it wasn't a joke. "Well, we could all use a little more of that." Elena nodded. "Yes, ma'am, we could." She left a generous tip and drove on. As the miles fell behind, the memories grew sharper, not the noise but the stillness. Helmand again. The night before the last mission. They'd been cleaning gear in silence, the faint hum of distant generators mixing with the dry wind. "Got a bad feeling about tomorrow," he'd said finally. "You always do," she teased. He looked up. His eyes were steady, but something else moved behind them, that quiet awareness soldiers get when they've lived too long on borrowed time. "If it goes sideways," he said, "you pull out, don't be a hero." She rolled her eyes. "You're the one who thinks the wind talks." "It does," he said. "You just have to listen close." She laughed then. What's it saying now? He'd glanced at the horizon, the faint shimmer of heat even in moonlight. It's saying we're not done yet. She never forgot that line, because 12 hours later, it became the last thing he ever said to her. The blast replayed in her head for years, sometimes in dreams, sometimes in silence. She'd wake up gasping, the taste of sand in her mouth, her hands still reaching for him through smoke that wasn't there. Therapists had tried to pull her out of it. Commanders had offered desk jobs. She'd taken the contractor role because it felt like halfway between staying and leaving, because it let her teach others to live where she'd failed to save one. Every day since, she'd lived with that balance between duty and memory, between silence and forgiveness. The shot at 29 Palms hadn't changed that. It hadn't healed anything, but it had reminded her that purpose doesn't always die with the people we lose. Sometimes it just waits for a steady hand to find it again. Near midnight, she reached a small motel on the edge of a ghost town. She parked beneath a flickering sign, checked in under E-Cross, and carried only her duffel inside. The room was bare, one bed, one desk, one old mirror. She set her rifle case gently in the corner. For a long time she just sat there, staring at the reflection staring back. 34, hair tied loose, eyes that had seen too much. Not the woman the Marines had laughed at, not the legend they now whispered about. Just someone caught between both. She reached into the duffel, pulled out an old, creased photograph. Two people grinning under the Afghan sun. Cross and Hale, Helmand Province. The same picture that hung at the 29 Palms range. She touched the edge of it, tracing the faint outline of his hand resting on her shoulder. The paper had faded, but the memory hadn't. Still believing in the living, she whispered, still trying. She laid the photo on the desk, beside the folded letter she still hadn't thrown away. Then she unzipped the rifle case and looked down at the weapon inside, the old M200, its steel gleaming softly under the lamplight. She ran her hand along the barrel, not in reverence but gratitude. "You've done enough," she said quietly. Then she locked the case again and turned off the light. Sometime before dawn, the dream came again. Not the blast this time, but the moment before. She and Hale, lying on their stomachs, overlooking a valley painted in amber. The wind whispering across the rocks. The flags at the convoy line below snapping in rhythm. "Wind shifting," he'd said. "You feel it?" She nodded. 5 knots west, you. 5.5, he smiled. "Guess we split the difference." "Or trust the silence," she replied. That was the last calm second they ever shared. When she woke, her face was wet, not from grief, from gratitude. Because for the first time, she dreamed him alive. Morning light crept through the blinds. The desert outside was still pale and quiet, the world just beginning to breathe. Alina stood at the window, sipping the last of last night's coffee. The wind outside shifted again, rattling the motel sign. She smiled faintly. "Morning, partner," she murmured. Then she folded the letter one final time, slid it into her duffel, and stepped outside. The truck started on the first turn. Dust swirled behind her tires as she pulled back onto the road. The horizon ahead was wide open. She didn't know where she was going next. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't need to. Some people chase peace. Some people learn to carry it. And sometimes, if you're patient enough, if you hold, breathe, and listen, peace finds you first. Why did the desert feel different now? It wasn't the air, though it carried the same burnt dust scent it always had. It wasn't the heat either, or the endless tan of the horizon. It was quieter. Not empty, just quieter. Like the land itself remembered what had happened a few days ago and decided to honor it with silence. For Gunnery Sergeant Mason, that silence had become a kind of ritual. Every morning before the first range bell, he walked down to Lane 7. No clipboard, no stopwatch, just him, the sand, and the plate. It still hung there, a perfect circle 2 miles out, untouched, gleaming faintly against the morning light. The whole dead center had never been filled, never painted over. The young Marines joked about it at first, called it the Holy Mark. But lately, even they lowered their voices when they mentioned it. Mason stopped at the firing bench, hat tucked under his arm. He ran a hand over the sandbags still stacked where she'd lain. Some of the fabric had frayed from the wind. It didn't matter. He kept them there on purpose. Every legend needed a place to start. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded note, her handwriting still faintly smudged from dust. Hold, breathe, listen. He didn't keep it for superstition. He kept it because it reminded him that humility could look like strength if you knew what you were seeing. He turned toward the range tower and saw Corporal Nolan already waiting, binoculars slung over his chest. The kid looked sharper these days, quieter too. Something in him had settled since that afternoon. "Morning, Gunny," Nolan said. "Morning, Corporal, you sleep." Nolan half smiled. Not since that day. Mason grunted, joined the club. They stood side by side for a while, the desert wind brushing their sleeves. The sun was climbing now, the light hard and gold. "You think she's coming back?" Nolan asked suddenly. Mason looked out at the horizon, eyes narrowing. "Nah, she's done with this part. People like her don't stay, they pass through, leave something behind and keep walking." "What'd she leave?" Mason smirked. "You tell me." The younger Marine thought for a moment, then said softly, "Patience." The word landed heavier than either expected. 2 states away, Alina was driving again. The same desert light, but a different horizon. The kind of landscape where radio signals died and memories got louder. She hadn't planned this route, just followed the old highways until the signs turned into numbers instead of names. Somewhere between California and Arizona, she stopped pretending she had a destination. The truck's tires hummed against the asphalt. The wind through the open window tangled her braid. For the first time in years, she let herself hum, a low, wordless tune Hale used to whistle before every mission. It wasn't music exactly, but it kept time with the engine. At a gas station outside Yuma, a kid working the counter looked up at her rifle case in the passenger seat. "Ma'am," he said nervously, "you military?" She smiled gently. "Was a long time ago." He nodded like he'd just met a ghost. Maybe, in some way, he had. While the tank filled, she stood outside watching the flag above the station sway against the bright sky. Its edges were frayed, the fabric faded, still flying anyway. She thought about Hale again, about how he used to salute even when no one was watching. "You don't salute for the rank," he'd said once. "You salute for the idea that somebody's still trying." That line had stuck with her longer than most people ever would. When the tank clicked full, she paid and drove on. The desert stretched open again. Back at 29 Palms, the Marines were changing quietly, subtly. Lewis had started running small workshops on wind reading. Not official ones, just informal sessions after duty. He used to teach by shouting. Now he taught by whispering. The younger troops noticed. They listened differently now, not for orders, but for the tone of something learned the hard way. Corporal Nolan had taken it even further. He kept a small journal, scrawling down everything he remembered from that day. Her stance, her breathing, the small details that seemed trivial then but meant everything now. On the front cover, he'd written, "Wind remembers the honest ones." The corporal who had mocked her private tours had been quieter than anyone since. He stopped talking during briefings, stopped showing off on the range. When Mason asked him why, he'd only said, "I used to think shooting was about being loud." Mason hadn't needed to answer. The kid already knew. Even the base commander, a man who'd served longer than most of them had been alive, had come out to Lane 7 one morning to see what all the quiet was about. He stood there for 5 minutes, looking through binoculars, then simply said, Don't ever touch that plate. And no one ever did. 3 weeks later, Mason received a sealed parcel addressed to him. No return label, just his name in neat handwriting. Inside was a single brass casing, polished clean, the same kind she'd fired that day. Taped to it was a note. For whoever's learning next. He didn't show it to anyone. He didn't need to. He walked out to Lane 7 at sunset, dug a small hollow in the sand beside the bench, and buried it there. Then he stood for a long while, watching the light fade behind the hills. "Rest easy, ma'am," he said quietly. The wind answered, not loud, not soft, just there. Elena reached the mountains by dusk. The road climbed higher, the sky turning deep violet. She parked on an overlook where the land dropped away in layers of rock and shadow. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to stop moving. She sat on the hood of the truck, sipping cold coffee from a dented thermos, the air thin and clean. Below her, the valley stretched silent and endless. She pulled the old photograph from her jacket, the one of her and Hale. The edges were curling now. She flattened it gently against her knee. "You'd laugh," she said to the empty sky. "They think I'm some legend." A gust tugged at the photo. She caught it before it blew away. "You tell me I'm still terrible at taking compliments." She smiled, the kind that hurt a little. Then she leaned back against the windshield and closed her eyes. The wind pressed against her boots, tugged at her sleeves. Somewhere in that whisper she almost heard him again, that half-mocking tone, always calm under pressure. "Wind's good, Cross, let it breathe." Her eyes stung, but for the first time she didn't fight it. She let the tears come, quiet and unannounced, not out of grief, out of memory. Because remembering didn't hurt anymore. It just existed. At the same hour, halfway across the desert, Mason stood with his platoon for the evening debrief. The light was fading, the sky painted gold and blue. He looked at the line of faces, young, sunburned, still learning. "Listen up," he said. "We're going to start doing things different. Shooting, not about power, it's about patience. It's about the space between your heartbeat and the trigger. You control that space, you control the shot." One of the privates frowned. "Sir, where'd you learn that?" Mason smiled faintly. "From the wind." The men chuckled softly, but the sound wasn't mocking, it was reverent. Later, when the last rifle cracked across the range and the dust finally settled, the echo carried farther than usual, a strange, clean resonance that seemed to hang in the air. Lewis looked up from his notebook. "You hear that?" Nolan nodded. "Yeah, sounds steadier." They both knew why. Something had changed at 29 Palms. It wasn't written in reports or carved into walls. It was quieter than that. But you could feel it in how the men spoke, how they carried their rifles, how they listened before they fired. The desert had learned her lesson too. Night came slow and heavy. Elena lit a small fire beside her truck, the stars reflecting in the rifle case like fragments of another sky. She opened her notebook, the same one she'd carried since Helmand. Pages filled with coordinates, formulas, fragments of wind calls and half-finished thoughts. At the very end she wrote, "Some promises take years to keep, some only need one shot." Then below it, smaller, "Believe in the living." She closed the notebook, laid it gently beside her, and watched the flames flicker low. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a ghost. She felt like someone who had finally heard the wind's last message and understood it. Far away back at 29 Palms, the night wind brushed over Lane 7, carrying sand across the firing bench, across the buried casing, across the plate gleaming in moonlight. If you listened close enough, it almost sounded like laughter, soft, distant, familiar. The kind of sound that lives forever in the spaces between noise and silence. Why did the range feel alive tonight? The sky was bruised purple and gold, the wind restless, the kind of wind that soldiers instinctively respected. Lane 7 stood silent, untouched, the distant plate glimmering faintly under floodlights. Gunnery Sergeant Mason stood beside the firing tower, hands in his pockets, watching his platoon set up for the night exercise. The order had come down from command, a full live fire assessment under low visibility, the kind of drill that tested patience more than aim. He'd agreed on one condition: no electronic spotters, no shortcuts, only eyes, instincts, and wind. Do it the way she would have, he'd told them. Now, as the Marines adjusted their optics, Mason watched with quiet satisfaction. The noise of youth was still there, laughter, half-serious bets, but under it ran a new current: focus, control, that strange calm that had appeared ever since the day the desert went quiet. He looked toward the horizon. The flags on the range snapped east to west, steady, readable. He smiled faintly. "Feels like she's watching," he muttered. "Who gunny?" asked Nolan, crouched by the spotting scope. Mason didn't answer directly. He just nodded toward the wind. "Her." Nolan grinned, small but real. "Then I hope she likes what she sees." "Kid," Mason said, lowering himself beside him, "she already does." The first rifle cracked, then another. The sound rolled across the sand, controlled, disciplined, almost musical. No rushed shots, no overcorrections. Every Marine waited for the flags, breathed, then fired. The reports echoed in even rhythm, like a heartbeat. Mason closed his eyes for a second, listening. This was new. This wasn't chaos. It was understanding. When he opened them again, the moon had risen pale and sharp. He turned to Nolan. "How's it look downrange?" "Pattern tight," Nolan said. "Low drift. Nobody fighting the wind anymore." "Good," Mason said. "That's the point." The corporal hesitated, then asked, "You think she ever knew what she started here?" Mason smiled. "If she did, she'd just tell us to keep our elbows in." They both laughed quietly, the kind of laugh that comes from respect, not humor. 300 miles away, Elena Cross stood outside a small cabin near the Arizona border. The night was cool, the wind softer than the California desert but still familiar. 1,000 crickets murmured somewhere beyond the brush. Inside, the cabin smelled of coffee and gun oil, a combination she hadn't realized she missed until now. An old man sat at the table, thick glasses perched on his nose, a cleaning rod in his hands. "Didn't think you'd actually come," he said without looking up. Elena smiled faintly. "You always said if I showed up uninvited, you'd make better coffee." He chuckled, the sound dry as the desert. "You still remember my worst habit." "Hard to forget," she said. "You taught me most of them." He looked up then, Sergeant Major Dean Vickers, retired. Her old instructor from sniper school, the one who'd once told her, "You'll scare the hell out of them one day, Cross. Mostly because you'll do it quietly." Now his face was older, lined like folded maps, but his eyes still sharp. "So," he said, pouring coffee into 2 chipped mugs, "you finally made peace with that rifle." Elena took a seat, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. "Maybe, or maybe it made peace with me." He nodded slowly, "Heard about the shot." "Everyone did," she murmured, "even the ones who shouldn't have." He smiled. "That's how truth works. It travels better than rumor." She didn't answer. Instead, she looked around the cabin, walls lined with photos, dusty trophies, a single faded flag folded neatly in a case. It felt like time had stopped here. Vickers leaned back. "You want to know what I thought when I heard?" She raised an eyebrow. He tapped the side of his cup. "Took you long enough." Elena laughed softly. "Took me 12 years. And it was worth every one of them," he said. "You can't rush grace." The silence that followed was comfortable, filled with memories of training fields and long hours of quiet correction. Finally, she said, "He'd have liked it, you know, the shot, the stillness." "Hail." She nodded. Vickers' expression softened. "He was a good one, damn shame." "Yeah," she whispered. They sat there for a long time, listening to the night. Then out of nowhere he asked, "You keeping count again?" She looked down at her hands, the faint scars on her fingers. "Not of shots." "Good," he said. "Only fools keep count of ghosts." Back at 29 Palms, Mason's Marines were wrapping up their drill. The air smelled of gunpowder and dust, the floodlights casting long shadows over the field. Mason gathered the men at the benches, their rifles cooling on the tables. "All right," he said, voice low but firm, "what we learned tonight." Nolan spoke first. "That silence isn't weakness." "Good," Mason nodded. "What else?" Torres, the former skeptic, cleared his throat. "That wind doesn't lie, we just don't listen." Mason smiled slightly. "That's closer." He let the silence stretch for a moment, letting them think. Then he said quietly, "You learn that out here you start hearing things most people miss. The rhythm, the pause, the difference between noise and purpose. She taught us that without saying a damn word." The Marines nodded, not out of habit but agreement. He looked toward the far horizon where the stars pressed against the black desert sky. "Remember this, all of you respect doesn't shout, it endures." The words hung there in the night like the echo of her shot, clean, final, understood. Alina stayed at the cabin for 2 days. She and Vickers talked little, but when they did, the words mattered. They spoke about training, about loss, about the strange price of being too good at something the world only celebrates when it's needed. Before she left, Vickers handed her a small leather-bound notebook, old, frayed at the corners. "What's this?" she asked. "My notes," he said, "from the first sniper class I ever ran, all yours." She turned it over, confused. "Why me?" "Because you finished it," he said simply. "Every lesson needs an ending." She opened it to the first page, scrawled in black ink. "The wind doesn't favor the strong, it favors the patient." She smiled. "Guess you were right." He grinned. "I usually am." When she hugged him goodbye, he patted her shoulder once, the old soldier's farewell. "Don't disappear too long this time." "I'll try not to," she said, though they both knew she probably would. That evening, as she drove back toward the highway, the sky ahead lit up faintly, flashes from training ranges far in the distance. She slowed the truck, rolled down the window, and listened. Faint echoes reached her, rhythmic, deliberate, not chaotic, controlled. Her chest tightened. "Good work, boys," she whispered. "You're listening." She smiled to herself and pressed the gas again. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the kind of empty that felt like freedom. At 29 Palms, Mason sat alone after everyone else had turned in. The desert wind tugged at his uniform. He stared out at Lane 7, moonlight catching the steel plate far away. He spoke quietly, knowing the sound would carry. "Ma'am, wherever you are there learning, you did that." Then he fell silent, listening. The wind rustled through the sandbags, across the buried casing. For a heartbeat, he swore he heard a voice, distant, calm, almost smiling. "Steady, Gunny, wind with you." He chuckled to himself, shook his head, and walked back toward the tower. Behind him, the plate shimmered faintly, reflecting the stars. And somewhere out on the open highway, Alina Cross drove through the night, window down, the desert wind threading through her fingers. She didn't know where the road ended, only that it still called her name. And for once, that was enough. Because sometimes, redemption doesn't arrive in applause. It comes quietly in the breath between heartbeats, in the whisper between shots, in the soft voice that says, "You did what you could. You listened when it mattered." The rest was silence. And peace. Why did the sky look gentler that morning? Maybe it was the light, that soft amber that comes just before dawn, when the desert looks less like a battlefield and more like forgiveness. Maybe it was the wind, the same wind that once mocked her aim, now moving calm and steady across the ridges as if it had finally learned respect. At 29 Palms, the Marines gathered quietly along the firing line. No orders had been given. No schedule posted. They simply came. Word had spread that Gunnery Sergeant Mason was holding a short assembly before rotation. Something about legacy, they said, but everyone knew what it really was. They weren't there for a speech. They were there because something in the air still belonged to her. Lane 7 gleamed under the early light, the steel plate catching the first rays of the sun. Nobody dared fire yet. Nobody even set up. The sound of boots on gravel broke the silence as Mason stepped forward. His uniform was crisp, but the hat under his arm looked worn, sun-bleached, edges frayed. In his other hand he held a small wooden box. "Morning," he said quietly. The group answered in low murmurs. He looked down the range once as if making sure it was listening too. Then he set the box on the bench and opened it. Inside lay a single brass casing, polished bright, engraved with 3 words: hold, breathe, listen. Nolan exhaled softly. "Is that?" Mason nodded, her handwriting. The Marines shifted, the weight of silence falling over them like a salutation. Mason continued, voice low but steady. "We bury this here today, not to mark the end of something, but to remind us what it means to wait, what it means to act without noise." He paused, letting the desert breathe with him. "She didn't teach us to shoot," he said. "She taught us to listen to the wind, to each other, to what's inside when everything outside goes quiet." He glanced at the young faces in front of him, their eyes fixed and clear. "That's rare. So when you fire from this lane, remember her. Remember what the wind told her." He knelt, dug a small hollow at the base of the firing bench, and placed the casing inside. Sand poured back over it, soft and final. No salute, no ceremony, just stillness. When he stood, the first sunlight caught the range in gold. The plate far downrange glowed as if lit from within. Nolan whispered, "Feels like she's here." Mason smiled faintly. "She never left." 300 miles east, the same dawn broke over Arizona's canyons. Elena sat on the edge of a cliff overlooking miles of red rock in silence. The sun climbed slow, turning the world copper and fire. Her old M200 rested beside her, not as a weapon anymore, but as a companion. She cleaned it one last time the night before, then pulled the bolt and set it aside. Now it was just steel and memory. She reached into her duffel, pulled out the small leather notebook her old instructor Vickers had given her, and flipped it open to the last page. With careful strokes she wrote, "Wind steady today, maybe it's time." Then she tore the page free, folded it, and slipped it under the rifle's cheek rest. Her gaze moved across the valley. In the far distance, the light caught something, maybe a hawk turning slow circles in the air, maybe nothing at all. But to her, it looked like motion with purpose. She thought of Hale again, the way he used to grin right before calling the perfect wind shift, the way he'd always say, "The trick isn't control, Cross, it's trust." She spoke to the open air. "You were right again." The wind rose gently, brushing her hair across her cheek. She smiled. "Guess we split the difference," she whispered. She sat there for a long while, watching the world wake up, the colors deepening, the shadows softening. There was no grand moment, no cinematic swell of sound, just peace slowly replacing weight. When she finally stood, she left the rifle where it was, sunlight gleaming on its barrel. She walked back toward the truck, boots marking soft prints in the red dust. At the door she turned once more, hand on the frame. "Keep watch, partner," she said. "The wind's yours now." Then she climbed in and drove away. Later that afternoon, the old instructor Dean Vickers stepped out of his cabin. He'd known she would come. He also knew she wouldn't stay. The sun hung high, the air still warm. Something caught his eye, a small envelope tucked under the cabin's porch rail. He bent to pick it up. Inside was a folded note and a Polaroid photograph. The note read, "For your next class, tell them the wind listens longer than we do. Cross. The photo was simple, a long shot of the desert, a rifle resting alone in the sun. He smiled quietly, shaking his head, always the poet. Then he tucked the photo into his coat pocket and looked toward the horizon. "You did good, kid," he said softly. The wind rustled the porch flag, just once like a nod. Back at 29 Palms, evening settled in layers of gold and smoke. Training was done for the day, but a few Marines lingered on the benches, reluctant to leave the quiet. Nolan packed his scope away, pausing to look one last time downrange. The plate gleamed faintly even in the fading light. He spoke under his breath, unsure if anyone could hear. "Gunny says she was part of Task Force Anvil. You think that's true?" Tors, the one who'd once mocked her, shook his head. "Doesn't matter if it is. She's the reason I shoot slower now." Nolan nodded. "Yeah, me too." They shared a brief grin, the kind soldiers use instead of words, then shouldered their packs and started walking. Behind them, Mason lingered a moment longer. He looked at the spot where he'd buried the casing, the faint mound already half smoothed by wind. He imagined her voice one last time, calm, patient, unbothered. "Hold, breathe, listen." He smiled. "Aye, ma'am." Then he turned and walked away. The wind picked up, brushing over the range, through the flags, across the plate. The desert whispered, not loudly but clearly. If anyone had been close enough, they might have sworn they heard the faint sound of a single shot rolling across eternity, clean, perfect, eternal. Night fell slowly, painting the desert in shades of blue and silver. Stars blinked alive, scattered and infinite. Somewhere far off, a lone coyote called, not mournful, just present. The wind shifted again, sweeping across every mile of open land that had ever carried her name, ever held her silence. It brushed against the rifle she'd left on the cliff. It swept through the firing range at 29 Palms. It moved through the photo on Vickers' porch. Everywhere it went, it carried the same message, one not written in ink or metal, but in patience and memory. That silence isn't weakness. That strength doesn't shout. That dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. At dawn, the sun rose over Lane 7 once more. The plate caught the first light of day, flashing briefly like a signal. And for one impossible second, if you looked just right, you could almost see two figures there, one tall, one slight, lying side by side behind a rifle, wind in their hair, waiting for the world to go still. Then the light changed, and they were gone. Only the sound of the wind remained. Steady, endless, free. Morrill voiced softly, over fading music. Sometimes respect doesn't come from noise or rank. Sometimes the loudest legacy is the one whispered between breaths, carried by wind, remembered by silence. Because real dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.